saved and completely free of drugs, completely healed. He got married. I did his wedding. He married a beautiful Christian girl. It was such a good thing. And at his wedding, I reminded him of his first day in church. And he went bright red. He was going, how embarrassing. I can't believe I did that. Anyway, besides that was completely had nothing to do with it. So Revelation is highly symbolic. You can't read it without you. Every 2 minutes you should have a notification on your phone, a little alarm that goes bing, bing, bing to remind you this is symbolic. Remember, this is all symbolic. All of it, it's symbolic. So Matthew 24, as we read in the introduction several weeks ago, that is literal. But that was Matthew, Mark, and Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse. But John's version is the book of Revelation, and it is symbolic. So it doesn't mean that you can't decrypt it and that you can't decipher it once you understand the fundamental message of the book, which is why it's important, I think, to connect it back to Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, which is when Jesus, that was all the same, by the way, he just repeats it in all three, when he's talking about the end times. So in my mind, as you know now, there is no doubt that these events are referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. Forgive me if you're a futurist. This is my opinion. I'm going to hopefully show you that bit, that's one of the big bits, is actually beyond doubt. Just like Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and all the others were referring to the first destruction of Jerusalem 600 years before that, when the Greeks came. So here in the book of Revelation and in Matthew 24, he's talking about the 70 AD. So it's got all the same elements. Revelation has all the same elements as Matthew 24 and the others. Earthquakes, famines, wars, pestilence, all of that. It's in both of them. Even the abomination that causes desolation, which if we've got time, we'll get to today. So what have we learnt? So here's when we're going to start to establish what we know. Not just what I think, and versus your opinion, my opinion. This is what we know. We're going to go back quickly to Matthew 24, verse 1 to 3, where it says, Jesus left the temple. The temple. Where was he leaving? The temple. And he was walking away when his disciples came up to him and called his attention to its buildings. What buildings? The temple, right. Do you see all of these things? He asked. What things? The temple. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left upon another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Okay, so we now know that Jesus is 100% talking about destroying the temple. Beyond doubt. This would have seemed inconceivable to these people since Herod had made it so massive. But as we know, history tells us, we're not in question, nobody would question this, not futurists, not historians, not idealists or preterists. We all agree that the Romans destroyed it 40 years later in the year 70 AD and killed all the people who were in Jerusalem, including all of those hundreds of thousands that sought shelter inside the temple itself when it was burned to the ground. So to this day, the ruins of that very event are evidence of that, of the destruction. If you go to Jerusalem, which I have, or if you've seen on the TV a place at Jerusalem called the Wailing Wall, this is where you see Jewish men or any men with a little skull cap on, and they're right up against a massive wall, and they're doing this. They're actually praying, and that's the closest you can get. That's part of the wall. And it's the only section in the whole perimeter, the only section where you can touch the actual foundation of the Temple Mount. Everywhere else that you go, about 100 meters either side of that, there's rubble. And it's been there for 2,000 years since the Romans destroyed it. So, verse 3, Jesus says, there it is. Jesus was sitting so he's just left the temple and he's walked out the gate and he's gone over to the Mount of Olives. It's not that far. How many people have been there? Yes, it's beautiful. You can just walk over to the Mount of Olives. And his disciples came up to him privately. They've been thinking about it. Tell us, they said, when's this going to happen? When's what going to happen? That stuff. When is the stones being? When is that going to happen? And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the edge of the end of the age? So what's going to happen? When's what happening? The destruction of the temple and the end of the age. So we saw when we first did the intro that phrase, the end of the age, is not the end of the world. It's not the end of time, because he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So to figure out what the end of the age could possibly mean, not at the end of the age, and of the end of the age. See that little word "and"? What's going to be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? What stopped? What was the end when the temple was destroyed? The Old Testament sacrificial system. That's what they're talking about. The Old Testament sacrificial system. When's that going to end? See, even though Jesus announced the new covenant when he first turned up in 26 AD and he started preaching, he said the kingdom of God is near, Mark 1:15, or kingdom of God's within you in Luke 17. You see these, he said the kingdom of God's here. He was the final great sacrifice. Yes, he is the once and for all sacrifice for the sins of the world. Yet, the Jewish priests kept sacrificing animals according to the old covenant after Jesus was crucified. They couldn't care less about Jesus or what his followers believed. They turned up the next day and sacrificed again. They kept going. For them, it was business as usual. But when the Romans destroyed the temple 40 years later, that was the end of their age. And to this day, they still haven't been able to sacrifice, because no temple equals no sacrifice. So the new covenant kingdom of God would now be able to expand across the world in both size and influence. So in other words, these guys were asking, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the old covenant Jewish sacrificial age? When's it going to happen? When's the temple going to be destroyed? And so Jesus answers them plainly and unambiguously. In verse 34, he says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until these things have happened." This generation, some of you, in fact, back in chapter 16 of Matthew, he says, some of you will not taste death before you see these things happen. In the very chapter before it, in one of his parables, also referring to the same event, chapter 23, he says, "Truly I tell you," this is verse 36, "this generation will certainly not pass away." Sorry, I tell you, all of this will come on this generation. There it is. He says it several times. So when he tells John the same thing, so he's now appearing to John in heaven. So John's now on, this is 37, 35 years later, John's on the Isle of Patmos, and Jesus turns up to him and says, "I'm going to give you an upgrade on that Olivet Discourse. I'll show you what it looked like from heaven." Jesus turns up to him, and he says in verse 1, Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to John." Verse 3, "Blessed is the one who reads this out loud, the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take it to heart what is written, because the time is near. Look," he says in verse 7, "he's coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on earth will mourn because of him. So shall it be. Even those who pierced him will see." Now, we also looked quickly at when you read that phrase, "coming on the clouds," and we see it in verse 30 of Matthew 24. You'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That was an expression, a well-known expression. I showed you it in Jeremiah chapter 4 and Ezekiel chapter 30, where it is an expression which means God is coming on judgment on a city. When you read Jeremiah 4, Ezekiel 30, and other passages, those were just a couple I read to you, where it says he is coming on the clouds against Egypt. He's going to destroy Israel. He's coming on the clouds against Israel. He's coming on the clouds against... That was that expression. It was well known as an expression of he's coming, not his second coming, or should I more accurately, the return of Christ. It's not referring to that. Do I believe in the return? 100%. He's coming. That hasn't happened yet. That's later. But this stuff has. So, in fact, John wrote this book, the book of Revelation, around 65 AD. So Nero's persecution, you remember I've talked about Nero before. Emperor Nero was the worst of the worst, and his persecution against Christians had already begun. He blamed the Christians for the big fire in Rome that most people suspect he's the guy that lit it in the first place. And so he in 64 AD, he starts to murder and burn and behead and throw them to lions and gladiators. He just started massacring Christians. 2 years later, in 66 AD, is when he said, right, go down and destroy Jerusalem. We'll go down and stop this Jewish war that's going on, the revolt. They're revolting against the Roman Empire. Go down and get them. So that all happened. So what I want to do today, in order to sort of further reinforce this paradigm for you, that we're talking about events that largely happened in the first century, I want to actually skip to the middle of the book of Revelation. So today we're going to look at chapters 12 and 13, or more accurately, chapter 13 and then 12, because that will help us to establish who the major players are. And again, hopefully put beyond doubt that, oh, I can see that now. I can see what you're saying. I want to also, before I start on that bit, because that's going to give us a little clarity and a framework with which to read the rest of the book, I just want to reiterate to you that this is not a deal breaker. I was a futurist. I grew up with that stuff, as most of us did. I grew up, looking for the Antichrist is coming, and the mark of the beast, and the European Union could be the 10 toes of the statue. I grew up with all that stuff. So it's been through a lot of research and a lot of academic research that I've discovered that actually that's not what it's referring to. So I'm convinced this is what I'm referring to, but if I have not a problem if you want to believe the Antichrist is still coming. I think you're wrong, but I don't care if you get it. It's not a deal breaker. Who cares, right? So, okay. Which is why I've never preached on this, because anyway. So here we go. We're going to start at chapter 13, verse 1. This is what we read. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its heads, and each head a blasphemous name. How many people have ever read this before? How bizarre is that picture? So we could speculate all we like about this fanciful creature, but we don't have to, since it's already interpreted for us in chapter 17. So let's go to chapter 17. If you've got a real Bible, open it there. And we're going to start at verse 9. For time, we can't read it all, but this is what the chapter 17 says. This calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now, how many people know Rome has 7 hills? It's quite famous, the city of 7 hills. It's always been that way. We even call it that today. Look up the Lonely Planet. If you've ever been there, welcome to the city of the 7 hills. Rome has 7 hills. We'll come back to the woman that he's referring to here when we return to chapter 17 in a few weeks. But spoiler alert, the woman is Jerusalem. Just saying. Anyway, we'll come back to her. Verse 10. They are also 7 kings. Did I tell you that Revelation is all symbolic? So it's both. He says the seven heads are 7 hills and 7 kings. So we know he's talking about Rome. What's this 7 kings thing? 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he'll only remain for a little while. The beast who once was, now is not, is an 8th king. There's a lot of speculation about him, by the way. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. So while it is tempting to find all sorts of crazy images on the internet about this actual thing coming up from the deepest part of the ocean, and it's actually a kind of hybrid dinosaur. No, it's not. It's all symbolic for kings, for people who are in authority. That's what chapter 17 tells us. And since Revelation is dealing with the judgment on Israel, everything is spoken of from Israel's perspective. You've got to understand that. So when he says a beast from the sea, another translation that a lot of translators say is a beast from over the seas. So if you were in Israel, from Israel's perspective, this particular group of kings is coming from overseas. That's all it means. And so that's, like I said, from Israel's perspective. We'll keep coming back to that sort of Israel's perspective a fair bit. So there is no doubt that this is actually a symbolic picture of the Roman Empire, and I'll show you why. Before you say, you can't say that, that's speculation, I'm going to try to prove it to you. And before I do, Kaz said, you really got to nail this one down, Pete. Tell them again, because I said, I've told them that. But anyway, this is not new. The second and third century church fathers, this is what they believed. This is what traditional and scholars and theologians for 2,000 years have believed. It is still the most widely accepted interpretation and has been forever. It's only in the last 200 years since John Darby sort of resurrected this theory of futurism, and then Cyrus Scofield popularized it in his Bible 100 years ago. That's, and the Americans, of course, they've just taken it, run with it, and they're the best at the internet. So that's why we all believe that. Anywho, but most people believe this. This is the traditional view. You can study that yourself. And I will admit, I'm happy to admit that there are some minor differences in the precise interpretation of who's who in the zoo, which horn is which king. But I'm going to show you what is one commonly accepted suggestion of the 7 heads. Are you ready? All right, thank you, Jeff. Here we are, the 7 heads of the beast. Boom. First one, Julius Caesar. He's before Jesus came. As we all know, he was the first king. He crowned himself king with his soldiers. He was actually part of what they call a triumvirate, which were 3 guys, him, Pompey, and so I don't know if you pronounce it Pompey or Pompey, but it's EY, not like the city, and Crassus. These 3 guys ran the Roman Republic. It wasn't an empire at that stage. And Julius Caesar ended up getting into a fight with them. He won, put a crown on his head, and on his way to the forum to get his crowning and his coronation authenticated by the Senate, on his way there, Brutus and all his buddies stab him in the back like 68 times. And that's the famous Ides of March, where he turns around and says, et tu, Brute, his best buddy, So that's Julius Caesar. Next is Augustus. He is strictly speaking, he was the first emperor of the empire. So Rome changed from a republic to an empire, and Augustus was their first emperor. The next guy is Tiberius. The next one was Caligula. If you're interested in Caligula, Netflix have a series called The Roman Empire, and one of the seasons is on that guy. Then you've got Claudius. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Claudius. We just read this beast has 7 heads. 5 have fallen. Nero was emperor at the time that John wrote this, 65 AD. So Nero, one is, and Galba, one is yet to come, but only for a short time. Galba actually did become emperor after Nero killed himself, but he only lasted 7 months before somebody killed him. And that guy only lasted a few months before someone killed him. And that guy only lasted a few months before someone killed him. And so they call it the year of the 4 emperors. We'll come back to that. But here we have the 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. Does that make sense? So Nero is the one that is. And again, spoiler alert, I personally believe, without doubt, I do, that he is the Antichrist. He's the man of lawlessness from 2 Thessalonians 2. He's the guy that Daniel's referring to. Because he was the worst of the worst. No emperor was like him before or since. He lost his mind, and he was absolutely barbaric. Okay, now for the 10 horns. Now, this is completely a Pete theory, okay? I told you I'd tell you when I'm speculating. So this following list of emperors to me makes more sense when you look at the 7 seals, which we'll come to down the track, okay? So here, now, I've put Galba as number 1 because we just read the 10 heads are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. And you remember he said with the 7 that the 7th guy has not yet received his kingdom. So he's the 7th head, but he's also the first horn. Does that make sense? Right? So here they are. Galba, Otho, Vitellius. As I said, all 3 of them lasted a few months each. They were all killed by their predecessor. And Vespasian, he's the guy that came along, and his soldiers killed Vitellius, and he became the emperor for about I don't know, 15 years or 10, 15 years, something like that. And his son Titus took over when he died. After Titus was Domitian. You've probably heard of that guy. Nerva was some old bloke who thought, what am I doing here? I don't want to be. He lasted a year and just quit. He didn't, because he knew what was coming. So he went, I'm out. And he gave it to Trajan, who then, when he died, gave it to Hadrian. Anyone heard of Hadrian's Wall? Okay, Hadrian, and then finally Antoninus Pius. He wasn't the last emperor, but as far as Israel's concerned, from Israel's perspective, he's the last one that we care about. He's the last one that has anything to do with any of this. And we'll get to that when we do the 7 seals. So that's your 10. So now what I want to do is read Revelation 13 again with that in mind. So back to Revelation 13, verse 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea. Now the dragon, we know from chapter 12, we'll get to that, is the devil. The dragon is Satan. All right, that's him. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 crowns on the horns, each with a blasphemous name. We know that's the Roman Empire now. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. Any Bible scholars here sound like that? That sounds familiar? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. It's from Daniel chapter 7. Straight out of Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel or in the whole book of Daniel, he has several visions. Do you remember he said he had a vision of a statue, and it had a gold head, chest of silver. Then he had the bronze midsection and legs of iron, right? And he said, you, O king, Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of the Babylonians, you're the head of gold. Then Persia's coming. And he explicitly names Persia is the next one, silver. And then in chapter 8, he specifically says the bronze midsection is Greece. A king from the Greeks will come. He will conquer the entire earth, Alexander the Great. And then when he dies, his kingdom's going to be split into 4, which it was. And chapter 11 of Daniel goes through the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south down in Egypt, and how they fought against one another, and Israel's right bang smack in the middle of it all, right? And then he says, and then there will be another beast come. But he describes in the other vision that the head of the beast, he sees another beast, and he says, "You're the Babylon is the head, but in this the one with the creatures, he says, you're the the leopard, and then the next one's the bear, the next one's the lion." So he's actually saying these are the kingdoms Daniel was talking about, actually explicitly explaining that. And as I said, Daniel 2 has Jesus, so that vision of the statue I just explained has these legs of iron. He said, well, we know that's the Roman Empire coming, and even futurists agree with that. They're just saying, what about the feet? Iron and clay, surely that's the European Union. Well, you tell me. When that in that vision, he says, so I see this thing, feet with iron and clay, and he goes, and then I see this rock cut out, but not by human hands, and it strikes the statue at the feet, and it grows. It blows all of those kingdoms away. They turn to dust and get blown away, but the rock grows to become a mountain that fills the whole earth. Who could the rock be? Jesus. When did he come? Into the feet. So we know the feet are also the Roman Empire, but at that time it was, it had gone through those 5 heads, one had fallen, and it was starting to become, and it was so big, they had all of these different regions around the empire, and that's what the 10 toes represent. So Rome is strikingly similar, by the way, to the characteristics of Babylon, immorality. In the Bible how it says, whore of Babylon, which we'll get to in chapter 17, because they viewed Babylon as a very immoral place, so was Rome. Rome was just like Persia, because Persians, they also worship their emperor. How many people have seen 300? The movie 300, when Xerxes says, I am a god, worship me. Well, that wasn't unusual. So when Rome came along and said, we have to worship the emperor, it was similar. And of course, Greece, because they had the same philosophies, they followed Greek philosophers, and they loved Greek architecture. So it was no surprise that the beast here in Revelation that we're looking at in chapter 13, verse 2, resembled the leopard and the bear and the lion. It resembled those first 3 kings. So the dragon then, it says, gives the beast his power and his throne and great authority. In other words, the devil gives the Roman Empire its power. Verse 3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. Interesting. Nero, as I told you, suicided. He thrust a sword through his neck and into his brain. And Galba, Otho, and Vitellius Galba actually committed suicide as well. Otho and Vitellius were both killed in quick succession. As I said, it was called the Year of the Four Kings. But what's interesting is that the whole world thought, this is it. The Roman Empire is ending. It looked like the Roman Empire was done for, but then Vespasian came along. Remember that guy I told you about? And he restored Rome's glory. He was a great general, and he restored Rome's glory. And the whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. Okay, verse 4. People worshipped the dragon, that's the devil. They worshipped the devil because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast, like I said. Emperor worship was a state religion. And the blasphemous names that he mentioned before, that's very important. We'll come back to that. But it's blasphemy to be, to say you're God, right? That was what the Roman emperors were doing. Nero, as I said, was the worst of the worst. And they asked, who is like the beast? Who could possibly wage war against it? Rome, undefeatable. I was watching the Roman Empire documentary last night, actually, thinking I might get something out of it for you. But the first season was on Commodus, but they just kept saying over and over again, nothing like the Roman Empire had ever walked on the earth. It was undefeatable. It was an incredible war machine. Their guys weren't bigger than the Vandals or bigger than the Gauls. They just had a system and an infrastructure that was just impossible to overcome. So all those normal guys, when they make the tortoise, apparently it's hard to beat. So verse 5, the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. 42 months. How long is that? 3.5 years. You're going to hear that a lot. Do you know Nero persecuted the Christians from 64 AD until his suicide in 68? Precisely 3.5 years. 42 months from when he first started persecuting and blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome until his suicide was 42 months. Interestingly, though, the siege of Jerusalem also lasted exactly 42 months, 3.5 years. They both did, so take your pick. Andrew Corbett, he's a theological doctor down in Tasmania. He's written a lot on this, and he thinks that the 1260 days, and then there's another one that says 1290 days, they're two separate events. One, that he believes, one is the persecution of the Christians that Nero did, and the other is just coincidentally the same amount of time is the siege of Jerusalem. And I said, well, what do you do with the fact that Jesus' ministry was also 3.5 years? This 3.5 thing keeps popping up. Anyway, verse 6, it opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in it. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people. This is the Roman Empire waging war against the Christian church and Jerusalem, where many of the first Christians still lived. Remember, back then, Jerusalem was still the hub. It hadn't really become Rome for quite some time, a couple of 100 years or 300 years before Rome was the center of the Christian church. It was still Jerusalem. So they were. So it's the Christians in Jerusalem. They were Jewish people, Christian Jews, the first Christians, and the rest of the empire. And to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. As I said, Rome conquered most of the world. When you watch the documentaries on it and they colour in the map, it's pretty much all red. Except for parts in Britannia. They hadn't conquered all of Britannia. Those Scottish were holding on. The Vandals, they never did quite beat the Vandals. And the Parthians, these guys were tough guys and they didn't quite beat them. But they did beat a lot of them. Okay. Where am I up to? Verse 8. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword, then with the sword they will be killed. Look at this. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. That's a hard verse to get around if you believe that God's going to protect you from any suffering. Clearly, we get caught up in it. A lot of Christians were martyred in that first century. and in the most brutal ways. But they knew that there was something better waiting for them. They knew that eternity is real, that heaven is real. And so they willingly gave their lives or refused to recant their faith because they knew that they'd seen Jesus. It's, I was saying to somebody, I think it might have been at Crystal Clear this week, that one of the greatest proofs of Christianity, one of the greatest proofs that Josh McDowell and who's the guy, the journalist guy that wrote the book about Lee Strobel, that's it. Those guys said that for them the greatest proof wasn't the empty grave, although that's compelling. It was really that these disciples were willing to give their lives, not just half of them, not just some of them, but all of them were willing to give their lives. Not one of them recanted. They're all going, well, we've seen him. It's real. We've seen him. And so they're saying, you better recant, take that back. And they're saying, I'm going to heaven, baby. Like do what you will. I know it's real. And so, because they'd seen something. Anyway, so given all of that, with the time remaining, I want to look at chapter 12 now. So chapter 13, I just showed you pretty clear evidence we're talking about the Roman Empire. It fits. So let's go back to chapter 12 and see if this adds a bit to that picture. Because verse 1, I'll just read the first 6 verses to start and then we'll go back and have a look at it. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon, and her feet, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman then fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days, which coincidentally is 3.5 years, which is the same as 42 months. All right, so let's go back and have a quick look at that. Great sign appears in heaven, verse 1, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Okay, so this represents faithful Israel. I'll show you why. There's always 2, by the way. There are 2 women described in the book of Revelation. And they represent faithful Israel and unfaithful Israel, the 2 women. So the faithful Israel, we get straight out of Genesis 37, where Joshua has a dream, and he says, I saw the sun, the moon, and the stars bowing down to me. How many stars? 12. That's the 12 tribes of Israel. Right, so we know that he said that was my mum, my dad, and my 12 brothers and sisters. Right? They're all bowing down to me. That is an image, always has been, always will be, the image of Israel. In the Old Testament, God referred to his faithful people as a woman who he had dressed in honor and splendor, Ezekiel 16, for example. But he also spoke of unfaithful Israel as an adulterous wife, in the book of Hosea and others. So there's these 2 women, these 2 images. One is faithful, one is unfaithful. Same in the New Testament. Jesus refers to his church as his bride. It's a bride. Yet in chapter 17 of Revelation, he refers to unfaithful Israel as an adulterous whore. So it's the whore of Babylon. All that. So there's these 2 women. And all of that is consistent with this woman in Revelation 12 as being faithful Israel, while the woman in Revelation 17, that we'll come back to in a few weeks, was unfaithful Israel. So verse 2 says, she was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. So faithful Israel is crying out for the Messiah to come and establish the new covenant kingdom of God. They were crying out. There's plenty of verses that repeat that, okay? Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon. What color is it? With 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. Who could that be? The Roman Empire. What was the Roman Empire's signature color? Red. So whenever the armies came, watch the documentary. There's always that scarlet red color. Okay. like I said, chapter 17's already told us that's the Roman Empire. But interestingly, I'll come back to it, but John changed the description from beast to dragon. Here he calls him a dragon, and that'll be explained in just a minute. But that beast-dragon thing's interesting, isn't it? So his tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to earth. I have always interpreted that as the next section of this chapter, when the devil gets kicked out of heaven, he took a third of the angels with him. That's how I even wrote that in crystal clear. But reading it again, I'm going, actually, that's probably the Romans who had defeated all of the Celtic Gauls, most of Europe, Egypt and Northern Africa, plus Asia Minor, before Jesus was even born. This great red dragon possessed by the devil has swept a third of the nations, a third of the stars, a third of the kings, a third of the authorities down to the earth. They didn't get them all. They didn't get the Vandals, Britannia, the Parthians. There was quite a few that did still resist them, but they really did a thorough job. So then it says, the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. Obviously, the devil's first attempt to thwart the kingdom of God was, well, at least when Jesus came, was the murder of thousands of babies in and around Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth. But Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus were told by an angel to hide in Egypt. So they were protected. So then she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. Her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. So the second attempt to devour Jesus and his kingdom was the combined effort of Jews and Romans persecuting Jesus and the first Christians. Ultimately, Rome was convinced by unfaithful Israel to crucify the Messiah. So they were working in cahoots. They crucified Jesus, but of course, just as his kingdom was being born, so at the one time, yes, at the same time it could represent Jesus the baby, but at the same time, the kingdom of God the baby. And remember, we saw that sometimes these images, like the image of 7 hills that the woman sat on, was the 7 hills of Rome, and they were the 7 kings. So in the same way, this can be the baby Jesus about to be snatched away, and also the kingdom of God that the early church. Does that make sense? Is this too much? You getting into it? Okay. Thanks, Donna. I didn't even see if it was Donna, but I bet it was, right? Clapping. All righty. So, of course, Jesus was snatched up to God and to his throne. That's when he was resurrected and seated at the right-hand side of God. That you can clap for. Yeah. And the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, this is where we got to understand that this picture that he's seeing is taking place in the life of Jesus all the way up to 70 AD. Not 2000 AD, but about 70. So now he says, so this early church is still a baby. It's only 40 years old. And, there's a bunch of Christians in Jerusalem and around the Roman Empire. Most of them are focused still in Jerusalem. And this little church is getting persecuted. That's what happened. So when 40 years later, Rome came to destroy Jerusalem, they all remembered Jesus' prophecy. When you see the eagles gathering, when you see the abomination coming, then flee for the mountains. And that's exactly what they did. And I told you how General Cestius had breached the walls, had gotten inside the city, and then for some inexplicable reason, so Josephus says, he withdrew for 3 days, and all of the Christians ran as quickly as they could. They didn't know how long he was gone for. They just went, quick, the Romans have gone, run, go. They didn't realize it'd be 3 days, but they got out of Dodge, and they were all saved. And that's what this verse is talking about. They were saved from the carnage that was about to be unleashed for 3.5 years. Verse 7, then, meanwhile, in other words, while that's happening, war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he wasn't strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon, here it is, who was hurled down, this is where they name him, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. So we discover here that the dragon is, in fact, Satan, and that the red beast with the 7 heads is now referred to as the red dragon because the Roman Empire was possessed by Satan. That makes sense. This verse is describing what happened in heaven. Once Jesus rose from the dead, Satan was defeated completely. All authority had been given to Jesus, and Christ had triumphed over the devil by the cross. Have a look at Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. Thank you, Donna. If Donna claps, everyone clap. Okay. Colossians 2:15, having disarmed the powers and authorities, that's the spiritual powers and authorities, Jesus made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Matthew 28:18, you all know this one. Jesus came and said to them, all authority. When did he say this? After he'd raised from the dead. He's raised from the dead, he goes, boom. We won. All authority has been given to me. That's what we're reading in Revelation. He was given all this authority, and the devil was hurled down because all authority was given to Jesus in heaven and on earth. Excellent. Verse 10, then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now has come the salvation and power of the kingdom of God and authority of his Messiah. The reign of Christ had begun, right? For the accuser, Satan, the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. Interestingly, the kingdom of God has increased constantly and continually for 2,000 years, despite the devil's best efforts now that he's been hurled down here. In fact, we seem to thrive more when he does his worst. It's crazy, but the Christian church, because let's face it, when the pressure comes, all of the lackluster Christians, all of the softies, the snowflakes, they all disappear. They prove they never really had it. They were the seed that fell on the rocks. They couldn't handle the heat. But all the ones that did stay, and those are the tough guys. Those guys can handle anything, and that's why when you've got a church full of them. Look out, world. You got people who actually put Jesus first. People who actually don't care. They don't care what happens to them. They only care about the kingdom of God and loving other people. And, oh man, it's unstoppable. And that's what happened there. Verse 11. So they triumphed over the devil by the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Ha ha! You can't hurt me. It was so amazing. And that's the way we still overcome Satan. In your life, the way you overcome Satan is by putting Jesus first. Jesus and his kingdom first. You're number one, that's it, I'm in. Burn the ships, like Pete said last week. Burn the ships, I'm all in. Can't go back. I love that old song. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. I'm all in. So, rejoice, verse 12, rejoice you heavens and you who dwell in them, but woe to you earth and sea. By the way, earth usually represents Israel, sea usually represents Rome, so woe to you two, because the devil has gone down to you and he is not happy. He's filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. When the dragon saw that he'd been hurled to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Acts chapter 8, verse 1, says, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. So this is the woman, faithful Israel. It's talking about her. Great persecution broke out, and it continued right up until Nero just amped it up even more. So there's this great persecution. And of course, he explicitly hunted Christian Jews and Gentiles while simultaneously wanting to put down the Jewish revolt. So that was all happening. Verse 14, the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness. We read about that in verse 6, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. Anybody want to have a guess at how long that is? 3.5 years. And out of the serpent's reach. So it's that same 1,260 days that we read about. In verse 6. The Christians actually found refuge at a place called Mount Pella, and the Romans couldn't find them, quite literally as it says here. Verse 15, then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. Now again, you've got to understand symbolic and expressions. Coming like a river or coming like a flood was a common expression for the advancing of an overwhelming, undefeatable army. They're coming in like a flood. Even when God comes in like a flood, it's usually an expression about an army coming in to wipe us all out. We're in trouble. So even after Nero killed himself, Titus, we remember him from the 10 horns, Titus stated his objective was to destroy Christianity as well as Judaism, thinking that destroying the temple would do the trick, since he thought the temple was also the root of Christianity. And he's quoted as saying, "Kill the root and the branch will die also." Thanks, Marcello. So that was all fulfilled again with this destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 16, but the earth, that is Israel, remember earth is Israel, but the earth helped the woman, the Christian Jews, the faithful Israel, Christian Jews, by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. That's simply saying that Jerusalem bore the entire brunt of Rome's attack. The Christians escaped to safety and the Romans couldn't find them, and Israel or Jerusalem copped the whole brunt, the whole river, the whole flood came upon Jerusalem, and the Christians are off in Mount Pella, safe as houses. Verse 17, then the dragon was enraged at the woman, faithful Israel, the Christian Jews, is enraged and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. That's the rest of the early church around the empire. Those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. Did you know all of the apostles, apart from John, who wrote this, were executed? And then there was the merciless persecution, as I've mentioned several times now, of everyday Christians, yet the church continued to thrive. Because of time, I'm going to finish there. I've got so much more I wanted to share with you. I was going to get to 666 and the abomination that caused. That's all next week. You're going to have to come back next week. Can I ask a favor of you? I know that what I'm sharing is new for most of us. Because I haven't got time in one message to cover the whole thing and sort of put it to bed, some of you might be going, aha, but what about this? Trust me, just all respect, if you want to believe that, that's fine, not a problem, not a deal breaker, but just give me a chance to explain. I don't have time to go into now, I'm going to talk about the beast out of the earth and the abomination and the Antichrist, and we're going to see who's who in the zoo according to a preterist viewpoint. But I am asking you to be patient with me. Is that okay? Because I'm doing my best here. I'm trying hard to lay it out really simply so that everybody can get a hold of it. But I'll tell you this much. Having been swimming around in this for the last, probably 6 to 8 weeks, every time, I said to Kaz, how was the retreat? She said, fantastic. I said, so was mine. And she went, what retreat? And I said, I read the Bible for about 15 hours yesterday and Friday. I can't get enough of it, and all that keeps coming back to me is fear God. Fear God. In a good way. I know God's saying to me all the time, don't paint me as a monster. I'm not a monster. I have a very, very long wick. I am very patient, very compassionate, very loving. You can trust me on that. But I do have my limits, and that's what keeps coming back to me. Don't forget, don't test the Lord your God. He is a consuming fire too, remember? Yes, he's a loving, cuddly dad, but he's also a consuming fire that will belt you if you step in. You know what I mean? So, Father, I thank you for the book of Revelation. It is good news. Because at the end of the day, it tells us, beyond the shadow of a doubt, no matter which view we have, whether we're preterists or futurists, that you are still sovereign. That you are in control, and that when we see the machinations of the world around us, we should not worry. We should not panic, because Jesus, you are well and truly seated on the throne, and we trust you, and we're all in. So I'm going to land probably most Sundays on this. Put him first. That's where he deserves to be. And if you want to do business with God, if you want to say, yes, I lift my hands up, lay my whole life down, that song, if that's the state of your heart and you want to reestablish it, come on down the front and do business with God. You might, I sometimes when I do that, I kneel down, not just as like an expression of where my heart's at. You know, he's my dad. I know I'm going to heaven. It's all good. He loves me. But sometimes I just kneel in his presence going, God, you are also to be feared and to be worshipped because there's none like you. So if you'd like to do some business with God, come down the front. If you need any kind of prayer, come down the front. Our guys would love to pray with you. Meanwhile, stick around. We've got a barbecue on today. So this gives you plenty to talk about. And you can all talk about how Pastor Pete's off his rocker and you believe in something else. But just keep coming back. Give me a chance and we'll see where we land with all of this. God bless you. Have a great day.
Jesus.